Hey everyone, tonight we're stepping into a world that probably sounds like your worst nightmare vacation destination. Europe, right after the Black Death finally loosened its grip on the continent. Picture this. It's around 1353. The Great Pestilence has burned itself out like a wildfire running out of fuel. And what's left behind is a landscape that looks like someone hit the reset button on civilization. Half-empty towns, overgrown fields, and a silence so thick you could practically cut it with a rusty blade. But here's the thing that might surprise you. What came next wasn't just slow, painful recovery. It was something far stranger and more fascinating. A complete reinvention of how people lived, worked, and saw themselves in the world. So grab something warm to drink, dim those lights, and let's dive into one of history's most bizarre comeback stories together. Before we get started though, hit that subscribe button if you enjoy these deep dives into history's forgotten corners, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from tonight. There's something oddly comforting about knowing we're all exploring these strange historical moments together, scattered across time zones, but united by curiosity. Now imagine waking up one morning in 1353 and realizing the nightmare is over. Not because anyone figured out how to stop it, but because the plague simply ran out of people to kill. The fever that had stalked your village for years just stopped coming back. You cough, and instead of preparing for death, you just need some water. Someone sneezes nearby, and nobody runs. This is where our story really begins. In that eerie calm after the storm, when survivors emerged blinking into sunlight that felt somehow too bright, breathing air that seemed unnaturally clean. The world looked the same on the surface, but underneath, everything had shifted. The first thing people noticed was the space. Everywhere you looked, there were empty chairs at dinner tables, vacant stalls in markets, houses with shuttered windows, and no smoke rising from chimneys. Entire families had vanished, leaving behind only their possessions and the haunting question of what to do with all that suddenly available room. But space, as it turns out, creates opportunity. And opportunity, especially when you're desperate enough, breeds revolution. The survivors who crawled out of Europe's darkest chapter weren't just picking up where they left off. They couldn't. Too much had been destroyed. Too many systems had collapsed. Too many authorities had simply died. What emerged instead was something unprecedented. Ordinary people discovering they had choices they'd never had before. Take the labour situation, for instance. Before the plague, if you were born a peasant, you stayed a peasant. You worked the same fields your grandfather had worked, paid the same taxes, bowed to the same lords, and died in the same patch of dirt where you'd been born. It was a system so rigid it might as well have been carved in stone. But suddenly, with half the population gone, those rigid rules started bending like green wood in a fire. Landowners who had once treated their workers like interchangeable parts were now desperately competing for every surviving pair of hands. Peasants found themselves in the unthinkable position of being courted, offered better wages, improved conditions, even small plots of land to call their own. Picture a world where the person who mucked out stables yesterday is suddenly being offered a handshake and a decent wage by a lord who would have had him whipped for looking up too boldly just a few years earlier. It sounds absurd, but that's exactly what was happening across Europe. The economic transformation was staggering. Wages doubled, sometimes tripled in many regions. Workers who had never held actual money in their hands were suddenly carrying silver coins in their pockets. The rigid feudal system that had seemed as permanent as mountains began to crack and crumble. Of course, the nobility wasn't exactly thrilled about this new world order. They fought back with laws attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, regulations dictating who could wear what colours, and desperate attempts to keep peasants tied to their ancestral lands. But here's the beautiful irony. They no longer had enough officials to enforce these laws. The bureaucratic machinery that had once kept everyone in their proper place had died along with everyone else. So you had this fascinating period where official decrees were issued and then promptly ignored. A peasant might be legally required to work for the same pittance his father had earned. But if he could walk to the next village and earn twice as much, well, who exactly was going to stop him? This economic upheaval triggered changes that went far beyond simple wages. For the first time in centuries, social mobility became possible. Not easy, mind you, but possible. A skilled craftsman could accumulate enough wealth to buy property. A clever merchant could establish trade connections that elevated their family's status. The rigid caste system that had defined medieval life began showing cracks wide enough for ambitious people to slip through. But perhaps the most profound change was psychological. People who had lived their entire lives being told exactly what to do, when to do it, and how to think about it, suddenly found themselves making decisions, real decisions with real consequences. Which lord to work for, where to live, how much to charge for their labor, whether to stay in their ancestral village or try their luck somewhere else entirely. This newfound agency extended beyond economics into every aspect of daily life. Fashion became a battleground as common folk began wearing colours and fabrics previously reserved for their social betters. Art took on darker, more personal themes as people processed their collective trauma through creative expression. Even religion transformed as survivors questioned doctrines that had failed to protect them and began seeking more personal connections with the divine. The church, which had been the unshakable pillar of medieval society, found itself wobbling dangerously. When your prayers don't stop a plague, when your priests die just as easily as everyone else, when your sacred relics offer no protection whatsoever, people start asking uncomfortable questions, not necessarily abandoning faith entirely, but definitely shopping around for alternatives. New religious movements sprouted like mushrooms after rain. Some were beautiful and contemplative. Others were bizarre and disturbing. Self-flagellating groups marched from town to town, believing they could appease divine wrath through public suffering. Mystics claimed direct communication with God, bypassing church hierarchy entirely. Heretical ideas that would have been swiftly crushed in earlier times found eager audiences among people whose worldview had been shattered. Education, too, underwent a quiet revolution. With so many clergy dead, the church's monopoly on learning began to slip. Secular schools appeared, often in the most unlikely places. A former grain storehouse might become a classroom where children learned to read not just Latin prayers, but practical skills like accounting and basic law. Knowledge, like everything else, became more democratic. The survivors weren't just rebuilding their world, they were reimagining it entirely. Villages began governing themselves when no lord bothered to show up. Towns elected their own officials when the old ones had died. People discovered they could solve problems, make decisions, and create order without waiting for permission from distant authorities. This wasn't happening in isolation either. News travelled along trade routes that were slowly reopening, carrying stories of successful experiments in self-governance, innovative farming techniques, and new ways of organising society. Communities began borrowing ideas from each other, adapting successful innovations to their own circumstances. The transformation wasn't universal or immediate. Plenty of places clung to old ways, and plenty of lords fought tooth and nail to maintain their traditional privileges. But the seeds of change had been planted in soil, fertilized by catastrophe, and they were taking root with surprising speed. What emerged from this chaos wasn't just recovery, it was evolution. Europe was becoming something fundamentally different from what it had been before the plague struck. The rigid hierarchies were softening, the impossible was becoming possible, and ordinary people were discovering they had more power than they'd ever imagined. This is the strange rebirth we're exploring together. Not just the story of how Europe survived its darkest hour, but how it used that darkness as raw material for building something entirely new. A world where a peasant's son might become a merchant, where a village could govern itself, where knowledge could be shared rather than hoarded, and where the future felt less like fate and more like choice. But we're just getting started. The economic and social upheaval was only the beginning of Europe's post-plague transformation. Next, we'll dive into how this newfound freedom manifested in the most unexpected places. In art, in fashion, in the very streets where people walked with straighter backs and higher heads than their ancestors had ever dared. Picture yourself walking through a European town square around 1360, and the first thing that hits you isn't the smell of fresh bread or horse manure. It's the colours. Bright, defiant splashes of crimson and azure and gold adorning people who, just a decade earlier, would have been lucky to own anything that wasn't the colour of mud. This wasn't accidental. This was revolution, worn on sleeves and stitched into hems. The survivors of the Black Death had discovered something intoxicating about beauty. After years of watching everything decay and die, after burying friends in mass graves and living in a world drained of joy, people were hungry for anything that reminded them they were still alive. And what better way to announce your survival than to dress like you actually mattered? The nobility, predictably, were horrified. They passed sumptuary laws faster than you could embroider a sleeve, desperately trying to maintain the visual hierarchy that had always marked their superiority. Peasants were forbidden from wearing silk, merchants couldn't don purple, and God help anyone caught in ermine who wasn't born to it. But here's the beautiful problem with trying to enforce fashion police in a world where half your enforcers are dead. It doesn't work. A baker's daughter would strut through market wearing a blue woolen dress that would have cost her father 3 months' wages in the old world. A blacksmith might sport a hat with actual feathers, purchased with coins he'd never dreamed of possessing. Before the plague taught everyone that tomorrow wasn't guaranteed. The authorities could write all the laws they wanted. Reality was happening in the streets, one gorgeous act of defiance at a time. This explosion of personal expression went far beyond clothing. Art, which had been the exclusive domain of churches and noble courts, began appearing in the most unlikely places. Tavern walls sprouted murals of dancing skeletons and grinning death figures. Not because people were morbid, but because they'd learned to laugh at the thing that had terrorized them. Death had become a character in their stories, rather than an ending to them. The famous Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, swept across European art like a visual epidemic. These weren't gloomy meditations on mortality. They were defiant celebrations of the fact that everyone, from kings to beggars, was equally vulnerable to the grave. There's something deeply democratic about a skeleton in a crown dancing with a skeleton in rags. The plague had been the great equalizer, and now art was making that equality visible. Musicians began composing songs in vernacular languages instead of Latin, creating melodies that common people could sing along with, rather than just listen to reverently. Poets wrote about everyday experiences, about love and loss and the price of bread, instead of exclusively praising distant nobles or abstract virtues. Even the way people carried themselves changed. You can see it in the art of the period, in the manuscripts and sculptures that survived. Figures stand straighter, look more directly at the viewer, occupy space with a confidence that would have been unthinkable in earlier medieval art. These weren't people who expected to be overlooked anymore. The transformation wasn't just aesthetic, it was deeply practical. With traditional authority structures in shambles, communities had to invent new ways of organizing themselves. Villages that had waited centuries for lords to settle their disputes suddenly found themselves holding their own councils, making their own decisions, solving their own problems. These weren't grand democratic assemblies. They were messy, informal gatherings where anyone could speak up, where decisions got made by whoever showed up and cared enough to argue their point. A blacksmith might find himself mediating between feuding farmers, A midwife could end up managing grain distribution. Leadership became less about birthright and more about competence. The church, meanwhile, was experiencing its own crisis of confidence. Priests who had watched their prayers fail to stop the plague found themselves preaching to congregations who listened with newly skeptical ears. People still attended services, but they also began exploring alternatives. Mystical movements flourished as individuals sought direct relationships with the divine, bypassing traditional ecclesiastical hierarchies. Some of these movements were genuinely spiritual. Others were frankly bizarre. Groups of flagellants wandered from town to town, whipping themselves publicly in elaborate rituals they believed would prevent future disasters. Prophets appeared claiming special revelation about the end times, gathering followers who were ready to believe that the world as they'd known it was indeed ending. The authorities, both secular and religious, viewed these developments with growing alarm, but their ability to suppress dissent had been severely weakened. Too many officials were dead, too many institutions were struggling just to maintain basic functions, and too many people had discovered they could survive without constant supervision. Education became another battlefield. The church's monopoly on literacy began cracking as secular schools appeared in market towns and trading centres. Parents who had accumulated modest wealth during the post-plague labour shortage invested in teaching their children to read and write. Not just prayers and religious texts, but practical skills like accounting and contract law. Knowledge, like everything else, was becoming more democratic. A farmer's son might learn enough mathematics to negotiate his own grain sales. A merchant's daughter could read well enough to manage correspondence with distant suppliers. The rigid intellectual hierarchies that had confined learning to monasteries and cathedral schools were beginning to blur. Trade networks that had collapsed during the plague years slowly reopened, but they functioned differently now. With traditional merchant families decimated, opportunities opened for newcomers willing to take risks. Former peasants became peddlers, peddlers became traders, and traders sometimes became wealthy enough to challenge established commercial hierarchies. Cities that had lost half their population began attracting migrants from the countryside, people seeking opportunities that rural life couldn't provide. These newcomers brought fresh ideas and different ways of doing things. Urban culture became more fluid, more experimental, more willing to try new approaches to old problems. The legal system, too, had to adapt. With so many traditional authorities dead or discredited, communities began developing their own approaches to justice. Village courts handled local disputes. Guild tribunals managed trade conflicts. New forms of law emerged from practical necessity rather than ancient precedent. Women, who had always worked but rarely been acknowledged for it, found themselves in positions of unprecedented responsibility. Widows took over businesses their husbands had run. Daughters inherited properties that would have passed to male relatives in normal times. The economic disruption created opportunities for women to demonstrate capabilities that traditional society had ignored or suppressed. This wasn't sudden liberation. Medieval society was far too conservative for that. But it was a subtle shift, a gradual recognition that competence mattered more than custom when survival was at stake. A woman who could manage a brewery or run a textile workshop was too valuable to waste simply because convention said she should stay in the background. The survivors were writing new rules because the old ones had died along with everyone else, and as they discovered their own agency, their own capacity to shape the world around them, something fundamental shifted in European consciousness. The future stopped feeling like something that happened to you and started feeling like something you could influence. This psychological transformation may have been the most important change of all. People who had spent generations accepting their fate as divinely ordained began to believe they could actually alter their circumstances, not through rebellion necessarily, but through choice, through effort, through the simple revolutionary act of believing they deserved better. But this newfound confidence came with its own complications. As people began asserting their rights and pursuing their interests, conflicts inevitably arose. The social fabric that the plague had torn apart needed to be rewoven, and that process wasn't always smooth or peaceful. The tensions started small, as they always do. A dispute over who owned a particular field when both the original tenant and his lord had died. An argument about grain prices when the old market regulations had vanished along with the officials who enforced them. A disagreement over church tithes when half the parish was gone and the surviving priest was barely out of his teens. But these small conflicts revealed something larger brewing beneath the surface. The survivors weren't just rebuilding their world. They were renegotiating the fundamental terms of how that world would work. And not everyone agreed on what those terms should be. The nobility, those who remained, watched these changes with growing unease. They'd initially been grateful for any workers at all, but as the immediate crisis passed, many began trying to reassert their traditional privileges. Lords who had offered generous terms to attract labourers now attempted to roll back wages. Nobles who had tolerated peasant defiance during the worst years started issuing proclamations about proper deference and social order. The problem was that people had tasted freedom, and freedom is a difficult flavour to forget. Workers who had been courted and respected weren't eager to return to being invisible and expendable. Peasants who had made their own decisions weren't thrilled about going back to asking permission for everything. This tension manifested in countless small acts of resistance. A miller who simply ignored demands to lower his prices. A group of farmers who continued wearing the bright clothes they'd grown to love, regardless of sumptuary laws. A village that kept holding its informal council meetings even after a new lord arrived and declared them unnecessary. The authorities tried various approaches to restore order. Some used legal pressure, dragging resistant peasants before courts and imposing fines or punishments. Others attempted economic coercion, threatening to revoke land leases or deny access to markets. A few resorted to outright violence, hiring mercenaries to intimidate communities that had grown too independent for comfort. But the old mechanisms of control had been weakened beyond easy repair. Courts that had once commanded unquestioning respect now seemed arbitrary and corrupt to people who had learned to solve their own problems. Economic threats carried less weight when alternative opportunities existed elsewhere. Even violence proved less effective against communities that had developed their own networks of mutual support. The result was a patchwork of compromise and conflict that varied dramatically from place to place. Some regions saw successful peasant revolts that permanently altered local power structures. Others witnessed brutal crackdowns that temporarily restored traditional hierarchies. Most areas experienced something in between, a gradual negotiation that left everyone partially satisfied and partially frustrated. The famous English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was perhaps the most dramatic example of these tensions exploding into open conflict. Thousands of workers and farmers marched on London, demanding an end to serfdom and the establishment of fixed, reasonable rents. They burned tax records, executed unpopular officials, and briefly held the capital itself. The revolt was ultimately crushed with characteristic medieval brutality. Its leaders were executed, its participants hunted down and punished, its demands officially rejected. But the very fact that it happened sent shockwaves throughout European society. Peasants weren't supposed to march on capitals. They weren't supposed to make demands of kings. They certainly weren't supposed to believe they deserved better treatment. Yet there they were, doing exactly those impossible things. And their example inspired similar movements across the continent. Not always as dramatic or well organized, but carrying the same essential message. The old ways were no longer acceptable, and change was no longer optional. The church found itself caught in the middle of these upheavals. Many clergy sympathized with the suffering of common people and supported calls for greater social justice. Others worried that challenges to secular authority would inevitably extend to religious authority as well. The institution that had once provided moral legitimacy for the established order now struggled to define its role in a world where that order was increasingly questioned. New religious movements continued to proliferate, some focusing on social reform, others on personal spiritual experience. Mystical traditions that emphasized direct communion with God gained popularity among people who had lost faith in institutional mediation. Heretical ideas about equality and justice found receptive audiences in communities that had experienced both divine abandonment and human solidarity during their darkest hours. The economic disruptions continued rippling outward in unexpected ways. Traditional craft guilds, which had maintained strict control over who could practice various trades, found their monopolies challenged by newcomers who had learned skills through necessity rather than formal apprenticeship. A woman who had taken over her husband's carpentry business during the plague might continue operating it afterward, regardless of guild regulations that technically excluded her. Urban centres became laboratories for social experimentation. Cities that had lost significant populations actively recruited new residents, often offering attractive terms that would have been unthinkable in the overcrowded pre-plague world. These migrations mix people from different regions and backgrounds, creating cosmopolitan communities where traditional hierarchies mattered less than practical contributions. The legal system evolved through similar pressures. Ancient laws designed for stable, stratified societies proved inadequate for dealing with fluid, dynamic communities. Local courts began developing new precedents based on pragmatic solutions rather than historical custom. Contract law became more sophisticated as people engaged in increasingly complex economic relationships. Property rights evolved to accommodate new forms of ownership and inheritance. Marriage patterns shifted as well. With so many traditional family structures disrupted, people formed new kinds of partnerships based more on mutual choice and economic necessity than on parental arrangement and social convention. Widows who might once have been passed along to male relatives like property instead remarried according to their own preferences, or chose not to remarry at all if they could support themselves independently. These changes in family structure had profound implications for child rearing and education. Parents who had experienced social mobility themselves invested heavily in preparing their children for opportunities that hadn't existed in previous generations. Schools that taught practical skills alongside religious instruction became more common. Literacy rates began climbing as people recognized reading and writing as tools for advancement rather than just markers of clerical status. The survivors weren't just adapting to change, they were accelerating it. Each successful challenge to traditional authority encouraged others to question established practices. Each innovation that improved daily life inspired further experimentation. Each act of individual agency contributed to a broader transformation of social consciousness. But this transformation wasn't uniform or inevitable. Many communities remained conservative, clinging to familiar patterns even when those patterns no longer served them well. Some individuals found the new freedoms overwhelming and sought security in traditional relationships, even exploitative ones. Regional variations meant that social change proceeded at different speeds and took different forms across the continent. The nobility adapted with varying degrees of success. Some proved flexible enough to evolve with changing circumstances, transforming from feudal lords into something more like modern landlords or business partners. Others rigidly insisted on outdated prerogatives and found themselves increasingly irrelevant to communities that had learned to function without them. A few embraced change enthusiastically, recognizing opportunities to profit from new economic arrangements. What emerged from this tumultuous period wasn't a single new social model, but rather a collection of experiments in living differently. Some succeeded spectacularly, creating prosperous and relatively egalitarian communities. Others failed catastrophically, collapsing into chaos or tyranny. Most fell somewhere between these extremes, achieving partial improvements while maintaining continuity with older traditions. The psychological impact of these changes extended far beyond their immediate practical effects. People who had witnessed the collapse of seemingly permanent institutions developed a more skeptical attitude toward authority in general. Individuals who had successfully challenged established practices became more confident in their ability to shape their own destinies. Communities that had survived crisis through cooperation learned to value collective action over passive obedience. This shift in mentality would prove to be one of the plague's most lasting legacies. The survivors had discovered something revolutionary. The world was not fixed and unchangeable, but fluid and responsive to human effort. Social structures that seemed as solid as mountains could crumble overnight. New institutions could emerge from practical necessity. Ordinary people could influence the course of history through their choices and actions. That realization, more than any specific political or economic reform, represented the true rebirth of European civilization. Not a return to what had been before, but the birth of something entirely new, a society where change was possible, where individuals mattered, and where the future remained open to human influence, rather than predetermined by divine will or ancient custom. The transformation wasn't happening in isolation. As Europe slowly stitched itself back together, something curious began occurring along the trade routes that connected these scattered communities. Information moved differently now, not just goods and coins, but ideas, techniques, and stories of successful experiments in living. A merchant traveling from one recovering town to another might carry more than silk and spices. He'd bring news of a village that had learned to govern itself through weekly assemblies, or a city that had developed new methods for settling disputes without involving distant authorities. These stories spread like seeds on fertile ground, taking root in communities ready to try anything that might work better than what they'd inherited. The speed of this cultural exchange was unprecedented. Where once innovations might have taken generations to spread across regions, now they jumped from place to place in months or even weeks. A successful farming technique developed in one valley would appear in another within a single growing season. A new form of craft organization pioneered in a German town might surface in an English village before the year was out. This acceleration of change created a feedback loop that pushed European society in directions nobody could have predicted. Each successful innovation encouraged further experimentation. Each community that prospered by doing things differently inspired neighboring communities to question their own traditional practices. The continent became a vast laboratory where human ingenuity was tested against practical necessity. But perhaps nowhere was this transformation more visible than in the realm of knowledge itself. The plague had decimated the ranks of educated clergy who had traditionally served as Europe's intellectual class. Monasteries that had preserved ancient texts for centuries lay empty or understaffed. Cathedral schools that had trained generations of scholars struggled to maintain their basic functions. Into this vacuum stepped an unlikely group of teachers. Practical people who had learned skills through necessity rather than formal education. A woman who had taught herself to read contracts so she could manage her late husband's business might find herself instructing neighbours in basic literacy. A craftsman who had developed new techniques for working metal could attract apprentices eager to learn his innovations. These informal schools operated by completely different rules than their ecclesiastical predecessors. Students learned what they needed to know, rather than what tradition dictated they should study. Instruction happened in common languages rather than Latin. The curriculum focused on practical skills like mathematics, basic law, and record keeping alongside traditional subjects like reading and writing. The results were remarkable. Literacy rates began climbing steadily as people discovered that reading and writing weren't mystical arts reserved for the clergy, but useful tools that anyone could master with sufficient motivation. Numeracy improved as merchants and farmers realized that understanding numbers gave them advantages in negotiations and planning. More importantly, the very relationship between teacher and student evolved. In traditional medieval education, knowledge flowed downward from recognized authorities to passive recipients. Students memorized accepted truths rather than questioning established doctrines. The new informal schools operated more like workshops where everyone contributed to solving practical problems. This democratic approach to learning had profound consequences. People who had been taught to think for themselves in educational settings began applying those same analytical skills to other areas of life. Communities filled with individuals capable of independent thought proved more adaptable, more innovative, and more resilient than those that relied entirely on traditional authorities. The Church watched these developments with growing concern. Not because education itself was problematic, but because this new form of learning operated outside ecclesiastical control. When peasants could read contracts for themselves, they became less dependent on clerical interpretation. When merchants could calculate profits independently, they needed less guidance from church teachings about just prices. Some religious authorities adapted by embracing these changes, establishing their own secular schools, or modifying traditional curricula to include practical subjects. Others resisted fiercely, condemning independent learning as a threat to divine order. The result was a religious landscape as fractured and experimental as the social one. New forms of spiritual expression emerged from this ferment. Mystical movements that emphasize personal relationship with the divine gained followers among people who had learned to trust their own judgment. Lay religious groups formed around shared interests rather than clerical leadership. Even traditional Christian doctrine evolved as theologians grappled with questions raised by communities that had experienced both divine abandonment and miraculous survival. The economic implications of widespread education quickly became apparent. A population that could read, write, and calculate was capable of much more sophisticated commercial relationships than one dependent on intermediaries for these basic skills. Trade networks became more efficient as participants could negotiate directly rather than relying on translators or agents. Banking, which had previously been dominated by a few specialized families, began attracting practitioners from diverse backgrounds. A farmer who had learned to track complex grain transactions might discover he had aptitude for managing other people's money. A craftswoman who understood profit calculations could extend that knowledge to investment decisions. Credit systems evolved rapidly as both lenders and borrowers became more sophisticated. Instead of simple arrangements based on personal relationships, communities developed formal contracts that specified terms, interest rates, and repayment schedules. Legal frameworks emerged to enforce these agreements and resolve disputes when they arose. The pace of technological innovation accelerated as knowledge became more widely distributed. Techniques that had once been closely guarded trade secrets spread freely among craftsmen who saw cooperation as more beneficial than secrecy. A blacksmith might share his methods for creating superior tools in exchange for learning new approaches to metalworking from a colleague. Agricultural productivity improved as farmers gained access to information about crop rotation, soil management, and animal husbandry that had previously been available only to large landowners with educated stewards. Small-scale cultivators could now implement sophisticated farming strategies that increased yields while reducing labor requirements. Urban planning became more systematic as city authorities learned from the experiences of other communities. Towns that had successfully managed population growth, improved sanitation, or developed effective governance structures shared their methods with municipalities facing similar challenges. The result was a general improvement in living conditions across European urban centres. The legal system underwent its own transformation as communities developed new approaches to justice that reflected their evolving values. Traditional medieval law had been largely punitive, focused on maintaining social hierarchy and deterring challenges to authority. The new legal frameworks emerging in post-plague communities emphasized restoration, compensation, and prevention rather than simple punishment. Courts began operating more like mediation services than judicial tribunals. Disputes were resolved through negotiation and compromise rather than authoritative decree. Community members participated directly in legal processes rather than passively accepting decisions made by distant officials. These changes reflected broader shifts in how people understood justice itself. In a world where everyone had experienced loss and hardship, there was greater empathy for human frailty and less enthusiasm for harsh punishment. Communities that had survived through mutual support were more interested in healing relationships than in establishing blame. Women played increasingly important roles in these evolving legal systems. Their experiences managing households and mediating family disputes during the plague years had given them practical skills in conflict resolution that communities now valued. Some regions began formally recognizing women's participation in legal proceedings, while others simply allowed their informal influence to grow. The transformation of gender roles extended far beyond the legal sphere. Economic necessity had forced many women to take on responsibilities traditionally reserved for men, and social disruption had weakened the cultural mechanisms that might have pushed them back into conventional roles once the immediate crisis passed. Female merchants became more common as women who had managed their families' finances during the plague continued operating their own businesses afterward. Craft guilds, which had traditionally excluded women, began admitting them as necessity overcame prejudice. Some regions even saw the emergence of all-female guilds organized around traditionally feminine crafts like textile production. Marriage patterns reflected these changing realities. With traditional family structures disrupted, people formed partnerships based more on practical compatibility and mutual affection than on parental arrangement and social convention. Dowries became less important than earning potential. Family background mattered less than personal character and skills. The demographic changes resulting from the plague created unique opportunities for social mobility that extended far beyond gender roles. With entire noble lineages extinct, hereditary positions became available to commoners with sufficient ambition and capability. Ancient estates changed hands as new owners purchased properties their ancestors could never have dreamed of affording. These rapid changes in social structure created both opportunities and tensions. Established families who had maintained their positions through traditional means sometimes found themselves competing with upstarts who owed their success to post-plague disruptions. Old money clashed with new money as different groups vied for influence and status. Regional variations in these processes created a patchwork of different social experiments across the continent. Some areas embraced change enthusiastically, creating relatively egalitarian communities where birth mattered less than contribution. Others maintained more traditional structures while adapting them to new circumstances. Still others experienced violent conflicts between competing visions of how society should be organized. The survivors were writing the rules as they went along, learning from their mistakes and building on their successes. What emerged wasn't a single model of post-plague society, but rather a collection of different approaches to the fundamental questions of how people should live together. This diversity of experiments would prove to be one of Europe's greatest strengths in the centuries that followed. Communities that had learned to adapt and innovate during the immediate aftermath of the plague retained those capabilities as they faced new challenges. The flexibility and creativity that had enabled survival during crisis became permanent features of European civilization. The psychological transformation was perhaps the most profound change of all. People who had watched seemingly permanent institutions collapse overnight developed a more realistic understanding of how fragile social arrangements actually were. This knowledge was both liberating and terrifying, opening possibilities for change, while highlighting the constant need for vigilance and adaptation. The survivors had learned something that their ancestors had never fully grasped: that society was a human creation rather than a divine ordinance, and that human creations could be modified, improved, or completely redesigned when circumstances demanded it. This realization would echo through European consciousness for generations to come, providing the intellectual foundation for future revolutions, reformations, and transformations. But we're still only partway through this strange rebirth. The social and economic changes we've explored were just the beginning of Europe's transformation. Next, we'll discover how this newfound confidence in human agency manifested in the most unexpected realm of all: the relationship between the living and the dead, between memory and hope, between the weight of the past and the promise of the future. The dead, as it turned out, weren't done teaching the living. Not yet. In the years following the plague's retreat, Europeans developed a peculiar relationship with mortality that would have baffled their ancestors. Death had always been present in medieval life, lurking in childbirth, harvest failures, and the countless small disasters that could end a life without warning. But the Black Death had been different. It had been so vast, so indiscriminate, so utterly overwhelming that it forced survivors to reconceptualize their entire understanding of what it meant to be mortal. This wasn't the comfortable, ritualized death of the old world, where people died in their beds surrounded by family, with priests offering last rites and communities gathering to mourn in prescribed ways. This had been death as chaos, death as rupture, death as the complete breakdown of everything civilized society had built to make mortality bearable. The artistic response was immediate and startling. Across Europe, images of death began appearing everywhere, but not the serene, spiritualized death of earlier Christian art. These were grinning skeletons, rotting corpses, and dancing bones that mocked the pretensions of the living. The famous danse macabre wasn't just an artistic motif, it was a cultural statement. Death was the ultimate democrat, and everyone needed to remember that fact. But here's what's fascinating about this memento mori obsession. It wasn't morbid in the way we might expect. Instead, it was almost celebratory. These images of death were often accompanied by scenes of feasting, dancing, and lovemaking. The message wasn't, "You're going to die, so despair." It was, "You're going to die, so live." This philosophy permeated every aspect of post-plague culture. Fashion became more extravagant as people who might have once saved for the future decided the future was too uncertain to plan for. Festivals grew more elaborate as communities that had survived catastrophe felt compelled to celebrate their continued existence. Even religious observance took on a more immediate, emotional character as people sought spiritual experiences that felt real and present rather than abstract and distant. The Church struggled to maintain its traditional authority over death and dying in this new landscape. For centuries, ecclesiastical institutions had provided the primary framework for understanding mortality, offering structured rituals and clear doctrines about salvation and damnation. But when prayers had failed to stop the plague, when saints had offered no protection, when entire monasteries had emptied overnight, that framework had revealed its limitations. New forms of spiritual expression emerged to fill the void. Mystical movements that emphasized direct communion with the divine gained popularity among people who had learned to trust their own spiritual instincts. Lay religious groups formed around shared experiences of survival and loss, rather than formal theological training. Some communities even began conducting their own funeral rites when no clergy were available, discovering that grief and remembrance didn't require official sanction. The relationship between individual memory and collective history also transformed. In the old world, most people's lives had been recorded only in the memories of their families and immediate communities. Formal records were kept mainly for the wealthy and powerful. But the scale of plague mortality had created a crisis of memory. How do you remember half a population when the other half is struggling just to survive? Communities began developing new ways of preserving the past. Memorial practices became more democratic, as ordinary people insisted their dead deserved to be remembered alongside nobles and clergy. Grave markers appeared in places that had never seen them before. Village chronicles began recording the names and stories of common folk who had contributed to their community's survival. Even illiterate populations found ways to embed their histories in songs, stories, and ritual practices that could be passed down through generations. This democratization of memory had profound implications for how people understood their place in the world. When your ancestors' names were recorded alongside those of kings and bishops, when your family's struggles were considered worthy of remembrance, when your community's survival story became part of the official record, your own life took on a weight and significance it had never possessed before. Education played a crucial role in this process. As literacy spread beyond traditional elites, more people gained the ability to read about their own histories and those of their neighbours. Local schools began teaching not just reading and writing, but local history and geography. Students learned about their own community's experiences during the plague years, creating a sense of shared identity that transcended traditional social divisions. The proliferation of written records also changed how communities made decisions about their futures. When you could read about what had worked or failed in similar circumstances, when you had access to accounts of successful innovations or cautionary tales of failed experiments, planning became more sophisticated and evidence-based. The survivors weren't just learning from their own mistakes anymore, they were learning from everyone's mistakes. Trade networks facilitated this exchange of information just as they had always facilitated the exchange of goods. Merchants who had once carried only silk and spices now also carried letters, documents, and stories. A successful agricultural technique developed in one region could reach farmers hundreds of miles away within a single growing season. A new form of craft organisation pioneered in one city might be adapted by guilds across the continent before the year was out. This acceleration of cultural exchange created something unprecedented in European history: a continent-wide conversation about how to build better societies. Communities that had once existed in relative isolation now participated in ongoing dialogues about governance, economics, education, and social organisation. The survivors were teaching each other, learning from each other, and building on each other's innovations in ways that would have been impossible in the more rigid, hierarchical world that had existed before the plague. The legal system evolved rapidly as communities encountered new types of disputes and challenges that traditional law hadn't anticipated. Property rights became more complex as people inherited land from distant relatives they'd never met, or purchased estates that had been abandoned during the plague years. Contract law grew more sophisticated as economic relationships became more varied and complicated. Criminal justice adapted to address new forms of social conflict that emerged from rapid change and cultural mixing. Women's legal status improved gradually as their economic contributions became too valuable to ignore. Widows who had successfully managed businesses or estates during the plague years continued operating them afterward, regardless of traditional restrictions on female property ownership. Some regions formally recognized women's right to inherit and control property, while others simply stopped enforcing older limitations that had become impractical. Marriage and family structures adapted to new realities. With traditional matchmaking systems disrupted, people formed partnerships based more on personal choice and practical compatibility. Extended families became less important as nuclear families, and voluntary associations took over many of their traditional functions. Child-rearing practices evolved as parents who had experienced rapid social change prepared their children for a world that was likely to be very different from their own. The demographic recovery that began in the decades after the plague created its own set of challenges and opportunities. Population growth put pressure on resources that had seemed abundant when fewer people competed for them. But it also provided the human capital necessary for more ambitious projects of reconstruction and development. Cities that had been half empty began filling up again, but not with the same kinds of people who had lived there before. Rural migrants brought different skills and perspectives to urban environments. Survivors from devastated regions settled in areas that offered better opportunities. The resulting cultural mixing produced new forms of art, music, literature, and cuisine that reflected the diverse backgrounds of post-plague populations. Urban planning became more sophisticated as city authorities learned from the experiences of communities that had successfully managed growth, improved sanitation, or developed effective governance structures. Public health measures that had been improvised during the plague years were formalized and expanded. Infrastructure projects that had been delayed or abandoned during the crisis were resumed with new urgency and better funding. The guild system adapted to accommodate new crafts and industries that emerged from changing economic conditions. Traditional guilds modified their rules to admit members who had learned skills through necessity rather than formal apprenticeship. New guilds formed around occupations that hadn't existed before the plague, or that had become more important afterward. Competition between guilds encouraged innovation and prevented any single organization from becoming too dominant. Agricultural productivity improved steadily as farmers gained access to better tools, improved techniques, and more sophisticated understanding of soil management and crop rotation. The consolidation of abandoned farmland into larger, more efficient units increased yields per worker. Investment in drainage, irrigation, and other infrastructure projects made previously marginal land productive. Regional specialization became more pronounced as communities focused on producing goods and services where they had comparative advantages. Areas with good soil concentrated on grain production. Regions with mineral resources developed mining and metalworking industries. Coastal communities expanded their involvement in fishing and maritime trade. This specialization increased overall productivity while creating more interdependence between regions. The monetary system evolved to accommodate more complex and frequent transactions. Banking services became more widely available as former farmers and craftsmen discovered they had aptitudes for managing money. Credit systems developed to finance larger projects and longer-term investments. New forms of insurance emerged to protect against the kinds of catastrophic losses that had devastated so many communities during the plague years. International trade resumed on a larger scale than before, as European communities sought markets for their specialized products and sources for goods they couldn't produce themselves. Trade routes that had been abandoned during the plague years reopened with new safety measures and better organization. Commercial law developed to govern transactions between merchants from different regions with different customs and currencies. The survivors weren't just rebuilding what had been destroyed. They were creating something entirely new, something that incorporated lessons learned from catastrophe while remaining open to further adaptation and improvement. The Europe that emerged from this process was more flexible, more innovative, and more resilient than the one that had entered the plague years. But perhaps most importantly, it was more conscious of its own agency. The survivors had learned that social arrangements weren't fixed by divine decree or ancient tradition, but were human creations that could be modified when they no longer served human needs. This understanding would prove to be one of the plague's most enduring legacies, providing the intellectual foundation for centuries of subsequent change and development. The transformation wasn't complete, of course. Many traditional institutions survived and adapted rather than disappearing entirely. Regional variations meant that change proceeded at different speeds and took different forms across the continent. Conflicts between old and new ways of organizing society continued for generations. But the fundamental shift in consciousness was irreversible. Europeans had discovered that they could shape their own destinies, and that discovery would echo through their civilization for centuries to come. The strange rebirth that followed the Black Death wasn't just recovery from catastrophe, it was the birth of a new understanding of what it meant to be human in a world where change was not only possible, but inevitable. The transformation of daily life in post-plague Europe revealed itself in the most mundane moments. Picture yourself waking up in a village around 1370, and the first thing you notice isn't dramatic social change or revolutionary politics. It's the smell of bread baking at dawn, but bread made from wheat that your neighbor now owns outright rather than farming for some distant lord. It's the sound of children playing in streets that echo differently because there are fewer of them, but the laughter is somehow richer, more precious. These weren't grand gestures of rebellion or carefully planned reforms. This was life reorganizing itself at the cellular level, one household decision at a time, one market transaction at a time, one conversation over a shared meal at a time. The survivors were writing new social contracts without even realizing they were holding the pen. Take something as simple as mealtime. Before the plague, most families ate whatever they could afford or grow, when they could afford to eat at all. Meat was a luxury reserved for special occasions or the tables of the wealthy. But in the aftermath, with livestock populations recovering faster than human ones, and with workers earning actual wages for the first time in generations, dinner tables began looking different. People started making choices about what to eat based on preference rather than pure necessity. A blacksmith might decide he preferred pork to mutton. A weaver could afford to buy spices that made food taste better, rather than just filling stomachs. Children grew up expecting meals to be pleasant experiences, rather than desperate attempts to stave off hunger. This might seem trivial, but it represented something revolutionary. When people have choices about what to eat, they begin thinking about choices in other areas of life. When meals become social occasions rather than survival exercises, families start having conversations that go beyond the immediate necessities of staying alive. The dinner table became a place where ideas were shared, problems were discussed, and plans were made. The ripple effects extended far beyond individual households. Markets transformed as vendors learned to cater to customer preferences rather than simply offering whatever they happened to have available. Competition emerged between sellers who had once enjoyed captive audiences. Quality became important when buyers could afford to be selective. Seasonal celebrations took on new meanings as communities that had survived catastrophe felt compelled to mark the passage of time more deliberately. Harvest festivals weren't just Thanksgiving for surviving another year, they were conscious celebrations of prosperity and continuity. Wedding feasts became more elaborate as families invested in ceremonies that announced their confidence in the future. Even the rhythm of work changed. The old system had demanded constant labor from dawn to dusk, with rest seen as laziness and leisure as sin. But when workers became valuable enough to negotiate their conditions, they began insisting on time for themselves, not just rest, but actual leisure. Time to think, to talk, to create, to enjoy life rather than simply endure it. This shift in work patterns had profound implications for family life. Parents who weren't exhausted every evening could spend time with their children. Couples could have conversations that went beyond coordinating survival tasks. Elderly family members became sources of wisdom and entertainment rather than just additional mouths to feed. The housing stock began reflecting these new priorities. Homes that had once been purely functional shelters started incorporating elements of comfort and beauty. A window positioned to catch morning light. A garden planted for flowers as well as vegetables. Furniture crafted for comfort rather than just utility. These improvements weren't limited to the wealthy. Workers who earned decent wages could afford small luxuries that had once been unimaginable. A ceramic cup instead of a wooden bowl. A woolen blanket dyed in bright colors. A lock for the door that actually worked. Each of these might seem insignificant individually, but collectively they represented a transformation in how people understood their own worth. Women's daily experiences changed in particularly striking ways. The plague had forced many to take on responsibilities that had traditionally been reserved for men, and the economic disruption had made their contributions too valuable to dismiss once the immediate crisis passed. A woman who had learned to negotiate with grain merchants during the plague years might continue managing her family's finances afterward. One who had taken over a craft workshop might keep operating it rather than handing it back to male relatives. But perhaps even more significant was the gradual shift in how women understood their own capabilities. Generations of women had been taught that they were naturally inferior, intellectually limited, and spiritually suspect. But when survival depended on everyone contributing their maximum effort, these assumptions had proven not just wrong, but counterproductive. Women who had successfully managed complex enterprises during the crisis weren't eager to accept diminished roles afterward. The education of children evolved as parents, who had experienced rapid social change, prepared their offspring for a world they expected to be different from their own. Instead of simply teaching traditional skills and obedience to authority, families began emphasizing adaptability, critical thinking, and self-reliance. Children learned to read not just prayers but practical documents. They studied mathematics not just for its own sake, but as a tool for managing business affairs. This educational shift created generational tensions, as young people who had been encouraged to think independently sometimes reached conclusions that challenged their elders' assumptions. But it also produced a population better equipped to handle continued change and innovation. And the survivors weren't just adapting to new circumstances. They were raising children who would be even better at adaptation than they were themselves. Religious observance became more personal and less institutional as people who had learned to trust their own judgment applied that same independence to spiritual matters. Church attendance remained common, but parishioners listened to sermons with more critical ears. They asked questions that would have been unthinkable in earlier generations. They formed their own study groups to discuss theological issues without clerical supervision. Some of these developments alarmed religious authorities, who saw challenges to institutional authority as threats to social order itself. But attempts to suppress independent thinking often backfired, creating martyrs and inspiring further resistance. Communities that had learned to govern themselves weren't easily intimidated by threats of excommunication or other traditional punishments. The legal system adapted to these changing attitudes through thousands of small modifications rather than dramatic reforms. Local courts began considering intent as well as action when determining punishments. Community standards evolved to reflect new ideas about justice and fairness. Even ancient laws were interpreted more flexibly when rigid application would have produced results that seemed unreasonable to contemporary sensibilities. Property relationships became more complex as traditional forms of land tenure proved inadequate for new economic realities. People who had purchased property with earned wages rather than inheriting it felt differently about their rights as owners. Tenants who paid market rents rather than feudal dues expected to be treated as customers rather than subjects. The resulting negotiations produced new forms of agreement that balanced the interests of all parties more equitably than older arrangements had. Credit and banking evolved rapidly as people with modest savings looked for ways to make their money grow, while borrowers sought capital for new ventures. Traditional prohibitions against usury became difficult to enforce when lending money at reasonable interest rates served obvious social benefits. New forms of financial institution emerged to serve customers who had been ignored by older banking systems. Urban planning began incorporating lessons learned from the plague years about sanitation, crowding, and public health. Cities that had seen how quickly disease could spread through densely packed populations invested in better water systems, waste management, and building codes. Market squares were redesigned to facilitate commerce while reducing opportunities for contamination. Housing regulations evolved to prevent the kind of overcrowding that had made earlier disease outbreaks so devastating. Rural communities experimented with new forms of land management that balanced individual ownership with collective responsibility. Common lands were managed more systematically to prevent overuse while ensuring fair access. Irrigation systems were maintained through cooperative agreements that shared both costs and benefits. Even property boundaries were adjusted when older arrangements proved inefficient or inequitable. The pace of technological innovation accelerated as communities invested in tools and techniques that could reduce labor requirements while improving productivity. Windmills and watermills became more common as entrepreneurs recognized their potential for processing grain more efficiently. New agricultural implements were developed to take advantage of larger field sizes made possible by land consolidation. Even simple improvements like better plows or more durable horseshoes had cumulative effects on economic productivity. Transportation infrastructure improved as communities recognized the importance of reliable connections to markets and sources of supply. Roads were maintained more systematically, with costs shared among the communities that benefited from them. Bridges were rebuilt stronger and wider to accommodate increased traffic. River navigation was improved through coordinated efforts to remove obstacles and maintain channels. Communication networks evolved to serve populations that were more literate and more interested in information from beyond their immediate neighborhoods. Systems for delivering messages became more reliable and extensive. News about political developments, market conditions, and innovations in other regions circulated more rapidly. Even gossip became a form of information sharing that helped communities adapt to changing circumstances. The survivors were creating a world that was not just different from what had come before, but consciously designed to be more responsive to human needs and desires. They weren't following ancient blueprints or divine commands, but making pragmatic decisions about how to organize society in ways that would serve their own interests and those of their children. This process of conscious social construction was perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of post-plague European development. Previous generations had accepted social arrangements as natural, inevitable, or divinely ordained. The survivors understood that institutions were human creations that could be modified when they no longer served their intended purposes. This understanding would prove to be one of the most enduring legacies of the plague years. Long after the specific innovations of the immediate post-plague period had been superseded by further changes, the fundamental insight that society was malleable would continue to influence European thinking. The survivors had discovered something that their ancestors had never fully grasped, that the future was not predetermined, but could be shaped by human choice and effort. The strange rebirth that followed the Black Death wasn't just about recovery from catastrophe. It was about the emergence of a new form of human consciousness, one that understood both the fragility and the plasticity of social arrangements. The survivors had learned to see themselves not as passive recipients of fate, but as active agents in creating their own destinies. This transformation manifested in countless small ways that collectively added up to something unprecedented in European history. People walked differently, talked differently, made decisions differently. They approached problems with confidence born of having survived the unthinkable. They embraced change as opportunity rather than fearing it as disruption. They built institutions designed to serve human flourishing rather than simply maintaining traditional hierarchies. The Europe that emerged from this process was more dynamic, more flexible, and more responsive to human needs than the one that had entered the plague years. It was a civilization that had learned, to adapt, to grow. And that capacity for continued development would prove to be its greatest strength in the centuries that followed, as Europeans encountered new challenges and opportunities that would have overwhelmed less adaptable societies. But we're still not finished exploring this remarkable transformation. The changes in daily life, work, and social relationships were just the foundation for even more dramatic developments in how Europeans understood themselves and their place in the world. The psychological revolution that accompanied the social one would prove to be equally profound, reshaping not just how people lived, but how they thought about living itself. The most profound change wasn't visible in the streets or markets, or even in the transformed relationships between lords and peasants. It was happening inside people's heads, in the quiet moments when they lay awake at night, staring at ceiling beams and realizing something fundamental had shifted in how they understood their own existence. For centuries, Europeans had lived with a particular kind of certainty about how the world worked. God was in his heaven. Kings ruled by divine right. Social hierarchies reflected natural law. And individual lives unfolded according to predetermined patterns that mortals weren't meant to question. Your father was a baker, so you became a baker. Your family served a particular lord, so you served that lord. You were born into a specific place in the great chain of being, and there you stayed until death released you to whatever judgment awaited. The plague had shattered this comfortable certainty like a hammer through stained glass. When the disease struck, It didn't respect social boundaries or divine favor. Priests died alongside prostitutes. Nobles perished in the same agonies as their serfs. Entire monasteries filled with the most devout believers emptied overnight, while tavern keepers who hadn't prayed in years somehow survived. If there was a divine plan at work, it was utterly incomprehensible to human reason. This randomness was terrifying, but it was also liberating. If survival had nothing to do with virtue, birth, or social position, then perhaps those things mattered less than people had always believed. If the old certainties could crumble so completely, maybe new certainties were possible. Or maybe, and this was the truly revolutionary thought, certainty itself was overrated. The survivors began approaching life with a kind of experimental pragmatism that would have horrified their ancestors. Instead of asking what tradition demanded or what authority commanded, they started asking what actually worked. Instead of accepting suffering as divinely ordained, they began looking for ways to reduce it. Instead of viewing change as dangerous deviation from proper order, they started seeing it as opportunity for improvement. This shift in mentality manifested in countless small ways that collectively transformed European civilization. A farmer who noticed that rotating crops improved soil fertility didn't worry about whether this innovation violated ancient customs. He just adopted the technique and shared it with his neighbors. A merchant who discovered that treating customers fairly generated more profit than cheating them didn't need theological justification for honesty. The practical benefits were sufficient motivation. Communities that had learned to solve problems through trial and error during the crisis years continued using those same methods afterward. When faced with new challenges, they experimented with different approaches, kept what worked, discarded what didn't, and remained open to further modification as circumstances changed. This was a radically different approach from the traditional method of consulting ancient authorities and implementing their recommendations regardless of outcomes. The Church struggled to maintain its interpretive monopoly in this new intellectual climate. For centuries, religious authorities had provided definitive answers to all important questions about how to live, how to organize society, and how to understand human nature. But when those answers had proved inadequate during humanity's greatest crisis, people began developing their own approaches to fundamental questions. This didn't necessarily mean abandoning Christianity, though some did. More commonly, it meant developing more personal, less institutional relationships with the divine. People who had prayed desperately for deliverance and received silence in return learned to find spiritual meaning in human connection, natural beauty, and the simple fact of continued existence rather than in formal religious observances. Mystical movements that emphasized direct spiritual experience gained followers among people who had lost faith in ecclesiastical mediation. Heretical ideas about equality and social justice found receptive audiences in communities where traditional hierarchies had proven inadequate for managing crisis. Even Orthodox believers began interpreting Scripture more independently, reading familiar passages in new ways that reflected their transformed understanding of what it meant to be human. The democratization of interpretation extended far beyond religious texts. Legal codes that had once seemed as immutable as natural law began being read as human creations that could be modified when they no longer served their intended purposes. Historical chronicles were examined more critically, with readers questioning the motives and biases of their authors. Even scientific texts inherited from ancient authorities were subjected to empirical testing rather than being accepted on faith. This critical approach to inherited knowledge produced remarkable intellectual ferment. Universities that had once focused primarily on preserving and transmitting ancient wisdom began encouraging original investigation. Students who had been taught to memorize authoritative texts started conducting their own observations and experiments. The very definition of knowledge began shifting from received truth to verified understanding. The pace of innovation accelerated as communities became more willing to abandon traditional methods in favor of demonstrably superior alternatives. Agricultural techniques that had remained unchanged for centuries were suddenly modified, improved, or completely replaced within single generations. Craft production became more efficient as artisans experimented with new tools, materials, and processes without worrying about violating guild traditions. Urban planning evolved rapidly as cities learned from each other's successes and failures. A sanitation system that worked well in one location might be adapted and implemented elsewhere within months rather than decades. Governance structures that proved effective in managing particular challenges were copied and modified by communities facing similar problems. The survivors had discovered something that would fundamentally reshape European civilization: the power of conscious choice. Instead of accepting their circumstances as inevitable, they began recognizing that many aspects of human life were subject to deliberate modification. This wasn't hubris or rebellion against divine order, but practical recognition that human agency could be exercised responsibly to create better conditions for everyone. This transformation in consciousness had profound implications for how people understood their relationships with each other. Traditional medieval society had been organized around fixed obligations and hereditary roles that supposedly reflected divine will and natural law. But communities that had survived catastrophe through mutual cooperation developed more flexible, contractual approaches to social organization. People began forming associations based on shared interests and complementary skills rather than accident of birth or geographic proximity. Craft guilds evolved into something more like modern trade unions, representing their members' interests while maintaining professional standards. Merchant associations developed sophisticated methods for managing collective enterprises and resolving disputes. Even religious congregations began operating more democratically, with lay members participating actively in governance rather than simply following clerical direction. Marriage patterns reflected these changing attitudes about human relationships. Young people gained more influence over their own matrimonial choices, as parents recognized that successful partnerships required personal compatibility as well as economic advantage. Love matches became more common, though practical considerations remained important. Divorce, while still difficult, became slightly more accessible as communities developed procedures for dissolving unions that had become destructive rather than supportive. The education of children evolved to reflect these new understandings about human potential and social organization. Instead of simply training young people to accept their inherited positions in established hierarchies, parents and teachers began emphasizing skills that would enable adaptation to changing circumstances. Students learned to think critically, solve problems creatively, and work cooperatively with people from different backgrounds. This educational transformation produced generational changes that accelerated social development. Young people who had been encouraged to question assumptions and explore alternatives sometimes reached conclusions that challenged their elders' beliefs and practices. But instead of suppressing this independence, many communities recognized it as preparation for a world that would likely continue changing throughout their lifetimes. The legal system adapted to accommodate these evolving attitudes about individual agency and social responsibility. Criminal law began considering circumstances and intent rather than simply punishing violations of abstract rules. Civil disputes were resolved through negotiation and mediation rather than authoritative decree. Even property rights were interpreted more flexibly, when rigid enforcement would have produced results that seemed unfair or inefficient. Economic relationships became more sophisticated as people developed better understanding of how markets actually functioned rather than how they were supposed to work according to traditional theory. Price controls that had once seemed necessary for social stability were abandoned when they proved to create shortages and black markets. Trade regulations were modified to encourage innovation and competition rather than protecting established interests. The survivors weren't following any grand plan or ideology. They were simply trying to create conditions that would enable themselves and their children to live better lives than had been possible under the old system. But their pragmatic innovations collectively produced something unprecedented. A civilization that understood itself as a human creation rather than a divine ordinance. This transformation in self-understanding would prove to be one of the most significant developments in European history. Once people recognized that social institutions were human inventions that could be modified when they no longer served their purposes, the possibilities for further change became endless. The Europe that emerged from the plague years had learned to learn, to adapt, to grow in response to new challenges and opportunities. The psychological revolution was perhaps even more important than the social and economic changes it accompanied. People who understood themselves as active agents rather than passive recipients of fate approached problems differently, formed relationships differently, and raised children differently. They built institutions designed to serve human flourishing rather than simply maintaining traditional arrangements. Regional variations meant that this transformation proceeded at different speeds and took different forms across the continent. Some areas embraced change enthusiastically, while others remained more conservative. But even the most traditional communities were affected by ideas and innovations that spread through trade networks, migration patterns, and cultural exchange. The nobility adapted with varying degrees of success to these changing circumstances. Some proved flexible enough to transform their roles from feudal overlords into something more like modern landlords or business partners. Others clung rigidly to outdated privileges and found themselves increasingly irrelevant to communities that had learned to function without them. The Church also experienced internal reform as religious authorities recognized the need to address changed spiritual needs and expectations. New forms of devotion emerged that emphasized personal relationship with the divine rather than institutional mediation. Theological education was modified to prepare clergy for ministry to populations that were more literate, more questioning, and more independent than their predecessors had been. What emerged from this tumultuous period wasn't a single new social model, but rather a collection of experiments in living differently. Some succeeded spectacularly, creating prosperous and relatively egalitarian communities. Others failed catastrophically, collapsing into chaos or reverting to older patterns. Most achieved partial improvements while maintaining continuity with valued traditions. But the fundamental shift in consciousness was irreversible. Europeans had discovered that they could influence their own destinies, and that discovery would continue shaping their civilization for centuries to come. The strange rebirth that followed the Black Death had produced something unprecedented. A society that understood change as normal rather than exceptional, improvement as possible rather than impossible, and the future as open to human influence rather than predetermined by fate. The survivors had learned to see themselves not as subjects of unchangeable circumstances, but as authors of their own stories. This transformation in self-understanding would prove to be their most enduring legacy, providing the psychological foundation for all the social, economic, and cultural innovations that would follow in the centuries ahead. The quiet revolution in human consciousness that accompanied Europe's recovery from the plague would echo through history in ways the survivors themselves could never have imagined. They had not only rebuilt their world, they had fundamentally changed how human beings understood their relationship to the world itself. And that change would prove to be as transformative as any technological innovation or political revolution in shaping the future of European civilization. But even as communities celebrated their recovery and embraced their newfound agency, shadows were gathering on the horizon. The world they were creating was more dynamic and more prosperous than what had come before, but it was also more complex and less predictable. The very changes that had liberated them from ancient constraints were about to create new challenges that would test their resilience in ways they were only beginning to understand. The first sign that something was shifting again came not with fanfare or proclamation, but in the subtle rhythm of everyday life. Around 1380, barely a generation after communities had begun to settle into their new patterns of existence, people started noticing things, small things at first. A cough that lingered too long in the marketplace. A family that hadn't been seen at Sunday Mass for several weeks. The kind of absences that might have gone unnoticed in the old world, but now triggered memories that ran deeper than bone. The plague was coming back, not with the apocalyptic fury of its first arrival, but like a familiar predator returning to hunting grounds it knew well. This time, people recognized the signs immediately. The subtle changes in how neighbors looked at each other, the way conversations grew shorter and more careful, the sudden appearance of herbs hanging in doorways, and the smell of vinegar becoming common in the streets. But here's what was different about this return visit. The response wasn't panic. It wasn't the complete social breakdown that had accompanied the initial outbreak. Instead, it was something far more remarkable: competence. Communities that had learned hard lessons about survival put those lessons to work with the efficiency that would have been unimaginable decades earlier. Quarantine procedures that had been improvised desperately during the first outbreak were now implemented smoothly and systematically. Houses were marked and isolated before infection could spread. Food and supplies were delivered to affected families without the chaos and abandonment that had characterized earlier responses. Even the dead were buried with dignity and proper record-keeping, ensuring that this wave of mortality wouldn't erase entire family histories the way the first had. The survivors had become experts at surviving. They'd developed institutional memory about how to manage catastrophe, and more importantly, they'd built social structures flexible enough to adapt quickly when circumstances demanded it. Villages that had learned to govern themselves during the recovery years now coordinated their plague responses through those same democratic councils. Urban communities that had invested in improved sanitation and public health measures found those investments paying dividends in reduced mortality rates. This wasn't to say the second plague was easy or painless. People still died, families were still broken, and communities still faced real hardship. But the existential terror that had accompanied the first outbreak was largely absent. People knew they could survive this because they had survived it before. More importantly, they knew how to survive it better. The economic disruptions were less severe as well. Markets that had collapsed completely during the initial plague remained functional during subsequent outbreaks. Trade networks that had taken years to re-establish after the first catastrophe continued operating with only minor interruptions. The diversified economies that communities had developed during their recovery proved more resilient than the rigid feudal systems that had been so vulnerable to disruption. This resilience extended to social relationships as well. The bonds that communities had forged during their recovery held strong under renewed pressure. Mutual aid networks that had emerged from necessity during the aftermath of the first plague were reactivated smoothly when need arose again. People who had learned to cooperate across traditional social boundaries continued doing so when crisis returned. But perhaps most significantly, the psychological impact was completely different. Where the first plague had shattered people's fundamental assumptions about how the world worked, subsequent outbreaks were incorporated into their understanding of normal life. Death was still tragic, but it was no longer incomprehensible. Disaster was still frightening, but it was no longer paralyzing. The survivors had developed what we might now call emotional resilience. They'd learned to hold joy and sorrow simultaneously, to plan for the future while accepting uncertainty, to invest in relationships while acknowledging their fragility. This wasn't callousness or indifference, but rather a mature acceptance of life's fundamental unpredictability, combined with confidence in there to adapt to whatever circumstances arose. Children born after the first plague grew up in communities where crisis management was simply part of normal social functioning. They learned from infancy that bad things could happen suddenly and without warning, but also that people could work together to minimize damage and rebuild afterward. This generation developed a kind of practical optimism that would have been impossible for their grandparents to imagine. The Church's response to recurring plague outbreaks also evolved significantly. Instead of interpreting each return of the disease as divine punishment, requiring elaborate theological explanation, religious authorities began treating it more like any other natural disaster that called for practical response and pastoral care. Sermons focused less on sin and judgment and more on community support and spiritual comfort. This shift reflected broader changes in how Europeans understood the relationship between divine will and natural phenomena. The survivors hadn't abandoned religious faith, but they had developed more sophisticated theologies that could accommodate both divine sovereignty and human agency. God might allow disasters to occur, but humans were expected to use their intelligence and resources to respond effectively. Educational institutions adapted their curricula to include practical knowledge about disease prevention and crisis management. Students learned not just traditional academic subjects, but also skills that would help them contribute to community resilience. Medical knowledge, previously confined to a small class of educated practitioners, began spreading more widely as communities recognized the value of having multiple people who understood basic health principles. The legal system also evolved to address the recurring challenges posed by periodic plague outbreaks. Inheritance laws became more flexible to accommodate the irregular patterns of mortality that characterized these events. Contract law developed provisions for situations where performance became impossible due to epidemic disease. Even criminal justice adapted to distinguish between actions taken under normal circumstances and those taken during health emergencies. Regional governments began developing coordinated responses to plague outbreaks instead of leaving each community to manage on its own. Information sharing between areas helped track the spread of disease and coordinate resource allocation. Some regions even began maintaining emergency supplies and trained personnel who could be deployed quickly when outbreaks occurred. The survivors were learning to live with recurring catastrophe as a normal feature of existence rather than an exceptional disruption. This represented a fundamental shift in human consciousness that would have profound implications for how European civilization developed in subsequent centuries. Instead of building societies designed to maintain stable conditions indefinitely, they began creating institutions capable of adapting quickly to changing circumstances. This adaptability became a defining characteristic of post-plague European culture. Communities that had learned to survive repeated crises became more experimental, more willing to try new approaches, more confident in their ability to recover from failures. The psychological trauma of the initial plague had been transformed into a kind of collective wisdom about how to navigate uncertainty. Trade relationships reflected this new understanding as well. Merchants developed more sophisticated methods for managing risk and maintaining commerce, even during disrupted conditions. Insurance systems emerged to protect against losses caused by epidemic disease. Banking practices evolved to accommodate the irregular economic cycles that accompanied recurring health crises. The artistic and cultural responses to recurring plague also showed increasing sophistication. Instead of the raw terror and desperate celebration that had characterized immediate post-plague art, later works showed more nuanced understandings of mortality and resilience. Artists began exploring themes of renewal, adaptation, and community solidarity alongside traditional memento mori imagery. Literature from this period reflects growing confidence in human agency and collective capability. Stories began featuring protagonists who solved problems through cooperation and intelligence, rather than simply enduring suffering or waiting for divine intervention. Epic narratives gave way to more intimate tales focused on ordinary people navigating extraordinary circumstances with skill and grace. Music evolved in similar directions, with composers creating works that acknowledged life's difficulties while celebrating human resilience and community bonds. Songs that had once focused primarily on either earthly pleasure or spiritual transcendence began incorporating more complex emotional landscapes that reflected lived experience of surviving repeated challenges. The demographic patterns associated with recurring plague outbreaks also influence social development in interesting ways. Communities learn to manage population fluctuations more effectively, developing systems that could expand or contract as circumstances required. Housing, infrastructure, and economic planning all became more flexible and responsive to changing population levels. Marriage and family formation patterns adapted to the realities of recurring mortality crises. People developed strategies for maintaining family lines and community continuity even when individual lifespans remained unpredictable. Extended kinship networks became more important as buffers against the loss of nuclear family members. Child-rearing practices reflected these adaptations as well. Parents who expected their children to face recurring challenges throughout their lives emphasized skills and attitudes that would help them navigate uncertainty successfully. Education focused as much on emotional resilience and social cooperation as on specific technical knowledge. The survivors were creating a civilization designed for permanence through change rather than permanence through stability. This represented a revolutionary departure from traditional approaches to social organization, which had typically emphasized maintaining existing arrangements indefinitely rather than adapting continuously to new circumstances. This cultural shift toward embracing change as normal rather than exceptional would prove to be one of the most significant legacies of the plague years. European societies that learned to thrive despite recurring crises developed capabilities that would serve them well as they encountered other forms of disruption and opportunity in subsequent centuries. The psychological transformation was perhaps even more important than the institutional adaptations. People who learned to find meaning and purpose despite life's fundamental uncertainty developed different relationships with time, risk, and each other. They became more present-focused, while simultaneously more future-oriented, more realistic about difficulties, while remaining optimistic about possibilities. This evolution in human consciousness represented something genuinely new in European history. Previous civilizations had certainly faced recurring challenges, but none had developed such systematic approaches to building resilience and adaptability into their basic social structures. The survivors weren't just learning to cope with catastrophe. They were learning to use catastrophe as raw material for continued development and improvement. The communities that emerged from this process were more dynamic, more innovative, and more humane than those that had existed before the plague years. They had learned to balance individual agency with collective responsibility, immediate needs with long-term planning, tradition with innovation. Most importantly, they had learned to maintain hope and purpose, even in the face of recurring loss and uncertainty. This transformation in human capability and consciousness would prove to be as significant as any technological or political development in shaping the future of European civilization. The survivors had not only rebuilt their world after catastrophe, they had reimagined what it meant to be human in a world where change and challenge were constants rather than exceptions. As the 14th century drew to a close, the strange rebirth that had followed the Black Death was revealing its true nature. This hadn't been simply recovery from disaster, but evolution towards something entirely new, a civilization that had learned to learn, to adapt, to grow stronger through adversity rather than despite it. The survivors had discovered capabilities they never knew they possessed, and those discoveries would echo through European history for centuries to come. But even as communities celebrated their growing mastery over the challenges that had once seemed insurmountable, new questions were beginning to emerge. If human societies were malleable enough to be completely transformed by crisis, what other changes might be possible? If traditional authorities could be challenged successfully when circumstances demanded it, what other assumptions about how the world worked might also be open to revision? The intellectual ferment that accompanied Europe's physical recovery was about to produce innovations that would reshape not just how people lived, but how they understood the very nature of knowledge, truth, and human possibility. The survivors had learned to question everything, and that questioning spirit was about to be turned toward realms of inquiry that would have seemed impossibly ambitious to their ancestors. The transformation reached a curious tipping point around 1390, when something unexpected began happening in the most unlikely places. Monasteries that had spent centuries copying ancient texts started questioning whether those texts were actually worth preserving. Universities that had built their entire existence around memorizing the wisdom of long-dead authorities began encouraging students to conduct their own investigations. Even village schools run by barely literate farmers started teaching children to ask why before they learned to accept because. This wasn't rebellion for its own sake. It was something far more practical and far more revolutionary. The survivors had discovered that asking questions produced better results than following instructions blindly. When your survival depends on figuring out what actually works rather than what's supposed to work, you develop a healthy skepticism toward received wisdom. Take medicine, for instance. For generations, European physicians had treated illness by consulting ancient Greek and Roman texts, bleeding patients according to astrological charts, and prescribing remedies based on theoretical principles that had never been tested against actual outcomes. But when half the continent nearly died despite these traditional treatments, some practitioners began wondering whether there might be better approaches. A few brave souls started keeping records of what happened when they tried different treatments. They noticed that patients who were kept warm and well fed recovered more often than those who were bled and purged. They observed that certain herbs seemed to help with specific symptoms, regardless of what ancient authorities had claimed about humoral balance. Most shocking of all, they discovered that some of the most respected traditional remedies actually made patients worse. This empirical approach spread slowly but steadily across Europe, not through official channels or institutional mandate, but through the practical networks that connected people who were actually trying to solve real problems. A midwife who noticed that washing her hands between births reduced infant mortality would share that observation with other midwives. A barber surgeon who developed a better technique for setting broken bones would teach it to colleagues who cared more about results than tradition. The church initially viewed these developments with considerable alarm. If people started questioning medical authorities, what would stop them from questioning religious authorities? If empirical observation could overturn centuries of accepted doctrine about the human body, might it also challenge established teachings about the human soul? But the survivors had learned to distinguish between different types of questions. They might investigate whether a particular herbal remedy actually worked, but that didn't necessarily mean they doubted the existence of divine providence. They could observe that prayers alone hadn't stopped the plague without concluding that prayer itself was meaningless. The intellectual sophistication that had emerged from their experiences of crisis allowed them to hold multiple ideas in tension without requiring simple answers to complex questions. This nuanced thinking began appearing in other areas of inquiry as well. Farmers who had learned to experiment with crop rotation and soil improvement started keeping detailed records of their results. They developed increasingly sophisticated understanding of how different variables affected agricultural productivity, knowledge that spread through informal networks of people who shared common interests in feeding their families and communities. Craftsmen began approaching their trades with similar experimental attitudes. A blacksmith might try different techniques for tempering steel, carefully observing the results and sharing successful innovations with other metalworkers. A weaver could experiment with new patterns or materials, keeping those that produced superior cloth and discarding those that didn't. Even simple activities like brewing ale or baking bread became opportunities for systematic investigation and improvement. The economic implications of this shift toward empirical thinking were profound. When people began making decisions based on observed outcomes rather than traditional assumptions, they often discovered that conventional wisdom about trade, production, and resource management was incomplete or simply wrong. Markets that had been regulated according to ancient theories about just prices began operating according to principles derived from actual observation of supply and demand. Urban planning evolved rapidly as city authorities learned to test different approaches to common problems, rather than simply following established precedents. A community might try various methods for managing waste disposal, keeping careful track of which approaches reduced disease and which created new problems. They could experiment with different street layouts to see which ones facilitated commerce while minimizing congestion. Legal systems began incorporating similar experimental approaches. Instead of rigidly applying ancient codes regardless of outcomes, some communities started evaluating whether their laws actually produced the results they were intended to achieve. When certain punishments proved ineffective at deterring crime, they tried different approaches. When particular procedures for resolving disputes created more problems than they solved, they developed alternatives. This wasn't systematic scientific method in the modern sense, but it represented something unprecedented in medieval European culture. Widespread acceptance of the idea that human knowledge could be improved through careful observation and testing. The survivors had learned that their lives depended on understanding how things actually worked rather than how they were supposed to work according to traditional authorities. The implications extended far beyond practical problem solving. When people began questioning established assumptions in one area of life, they often found themselves questioning assumptions in other areas as well. A farmer who discovered that conventional planting schedules weren't optimal might begin wondering whether conventional social arrangements were optimal either. A merchant who learned that traditional pricing strategies weren't most profitable could start questioning whether traditional power structures were most beneficial. This intellectual ferment created tensions with established authorities who had built their legitimacy on claims to possess definitive knowledge about how society should be organized. Noble families that had justified their privileges by appealing to ancient customs found those customs being subjected to uncomfortable scrutiny. Religious institutions that had maintained authority by claiming exclusive access to divine truth discovered that lay people were developing their own theological insights based on personal spiritual experiences. The response from traditional elites was predictably mixed. Some proved flexible enough to adapt their authority to changing circumstances, transforming themselves from sources of unquestionable commands into providers of valuable services. A lord who recognized that his tenants were evaluating his performance based on results might focus on becoming genuinely helpful rather than simply demanding obedience. A priest who understood that his parishioners were comparing different approaches to spiritual life might concentrate on offering genuine pastoral care rather than just asserting doctrinal correctness. Others reacted with increasing rigidity, issuing ever more elaborate justifications for arrangements that were becoming obviously inadequate. These authorities often found themselves in the peculiar position of having to defend practices that everyone could see weren't working very well. Their insistence on maintaining traditional forms often accelerated the very changes they were trying to prevent. Regional variations in these patterns created a patchwork of different experiments in combining old and new approaches to knowledge and authority. Some areas saw smooth transitions as traditional leaders adapted successfully to changing expectations. Others experienced more dramatic conflicts as different groups competed to define new terms of social organization. Most regions developed hybrid arrangements that preserved valued traditions while incorporating useful innovations. The educational implications were particularly significant. When communities began valuing practical problem-solving skills as much as traditional learning, schools had to modify their curricula to prepare students for a world where adaptability mattered more than conformity. Children learned to read not just religious texts, but also contracts, technical manuals, and observational records. They studied mathematics not just as abstract theory, but as a tool for managing real-world challenges. This educational transformation produced generational changes that accelerated social development. Young people who had been taught to question assumptions and test ideas sometimes reached conclusions that challenged their elders' beliefs and practices. But instead of automatically suppressing this independence, many communities recognized it as preparation for continued adaptation to changing circumstances. The survivors were creating something unprecedented in European history, a civilization that valued learning from experience as much as learning from tradition. This didn't mean abandoning all inherited wisdom, but rather developing sophisticated methods for distinguishing between traditions that remained useful and those that had become obstacles to continued development. The psychological transformation was perhaps even more significant than the intellectual changes it accompanied. People who learned to trust their own observations and reasoning developed different relationships with authority, tradition, and change itself. They became more confident in their ability to solve problems, more skeptical of claims that couldn't be verified, and more willing to experiment with new approaches when established methods proved inadequate. This shift in consciousness would prove to be one of the most enduring legacies of the plague years. Long after the specific innovations of the immediate post-plague period had been superseded by further developments, the fundamental insight that human knowledge could be improved through systematic investigation would continue influencing European thinking. The survivors had discovered something their ancestors had never fully grasped, that understanding could grow through human effort, rather than being limited to what had been revealed by ancient authorities. But even as communities celebrated their growing intellectual sophistication, new challenges were emerging that would test their problem-solving capabilities in unexpected ways. The very success of their experimental approaches was creating opportunities and complications that previous generations could never have imagined. The survivors had learned to change their world, but they were about to discover that a world capable of change never stopped changing. The innovations that had emerged from necessity during the recovery years were beginning to interact with each other in ways that produced entirely new possibilities and problems. Agricultural improvements had increased food production, but they had also freed up labor for other activities. Educational advances had created more literate populations, but they had also generated new forms of social tension as people questioned established arrangements. Economic developments had improved living standards, but they had also created new forms of inequality and competition. The survivors found themselves managing not just recovery from past catastrophe, but navigation of ongoing transformation that seemed to accelerate rather than stabilize over time. They had learned to adapt to change, but now they were discovering that adaptation itself created changes that required further adaptation. The strange rebirth that had followed the Black Death was revealing itself as something more complex and ongoing than anyone had initially realized. The civilization that emerged from this process was more dynamic, more innovative, and more responsive to human needs than anything that had existed before in European history. But it was also more unpredictable, more demanding of its participants, and more dependent on continued learning and adaptation for its success. The survivors had created a world that offered unprecedented opportunities for human flourishing, but only for those who could learn to thrive in conditions of permanent change rather than permanent stability. As the 14th century gave way to the 15th, the true magnitude of the transformation that had begun with the Black Death was becoming apparent. This hadn't been simply recovery from disaster, but evolution toward an entirely new form of human civilization. The survivors had not only rebuilt their world, they had fundamentally altered what it meant to live in that world, and the changes they had set in motion would continue reverberating through European history for centuries to come, creating possibilities that would have been literally unthinkable to their ancestors, who had first faced the great mortality so many years before. The transformation had reached a point where even the survivors themselves struggled to recognize the world they were creating. By the early 1400s, something extraordinary was happening across Europe that defied every assumption about how societies were supposed to develop. Villages that had once existed in near-complete isolation were now connected by networks of communication that carried ideas faster than anyone had thought possible. Knowledge that had taken generations to spread in the old world now jumped from community to community in months or even weeks. This wasn't just about improved roads or better horses, though both of those helped. It was about a fundamental shift in how people understood information itself. The survivors had learned during their darkest years that knowing what worked in other places could mean the difference between thriving and merely surviving. So they had built systems for sharing discoveries, techniques, and innovations with an urgency that would have seemed absurd to their ancestors. A breakthrough in crop rotation developed in one valley would reach farmers 300 miles away before the next planting season. A new method for organizing craft production pioneered in a German town might appear in English workshops within the year. Even social innovations traveled these networks. Word of a village that had successfully resolved a complex inheritance dispute through community mediation would spread to other communities facing similar challenges. The speed of this cultural exchange created something unprecedented in medieval history. For the first time, ordinary people across the continent were participating in ongoing conversations about how to solve common problems. A weaver in Florence might be experimenting with techniques suggested by a colleague in Flanders. A village council in England could be debating governance methods they'd heard about from travellers who'd visited similar communities in France. This intellectual ferment was producing results that surprised everyone involved. Innovations that might have taken centuries to develop through isolated experimentation were emerging in decades through collaborative problem-solving. The survivors weren't just learning from their own mistakes anymore. They were learning from everyone's mistakes and building on everyone's successes. The church watched these developments with growing unease, not because the exchanges were necessarily heretical, but because they were happening outside traditional channels of authority and oversight. When knowledge flowed horizontally through networks of practitioners, rather than vertically through established institutions, it became much harder to control what people learned or how they applied their learning. Some religious authorities adapted by joining these informal networks themselves, contributing theological insights while gaining practical knowledge about how their communities were actually functioning. Others attempted to suppress the exchanges entirely, issuing proclamations against unauthorized teaching and informal education. But the networks had become too useful and too widespread to eliminate through official prohibition. The economic implications were staggering. Regions that had once been limited to producing whatever their local resources and traditional skills allowed were now able to specialize in areas where they had natural advantages while importing techniques and materials from elsewhere. A coastal community might focus on developing superior fishing and preservation methods, while learning agricultural innovations from inland neighbors. A mountainous region could concentrate on mining and metalwork while adopting textile techniques from areas with better access to fiber sources. This specialization created unprecedented prosperity in many areas, but it also created new forms of dependency and vulnerability. Communities that had once been self-sufficient now relied on complex networks of exchange that could be disrupted by conflicts, diseases, or simple misunderstandings between trading partners. The survivors discovered that the same interconnectedness that made them stronger also made them more fragile in unexpected ways. Urban centers became the focal points for these expanding networks. Cities that had been half empty after the plague began attracting migrants not just from the immediate countryside, but from across the continent. These weren't desperate refugees anymore, but skilled craftsmen, ambitious merchants, and innovative farmers who were drawn by opportunities that simply didn't exist in smaller communities. The cultural mixing that resulted from this migration produced remarkable innovations in art, music, literature, and even cuisine. A single neighborhood might include families from a dozen different regions, each contributing their own traditions while adapting to local customs. Children grew up hearing multiple languages and learning diverse approaches to common activities. The rigid regional identities that had once defined medieval Europe began blurring into something more fluid and cosmopolitan. But this cultural blending also created tensions that communities struggled to manage. Different groups had different expectations about everything from business practices to family relationships to religious observances. Conflicts arose over competing claims about the proper way to organize work, resolve disputes, or celebrate important events. Some communities developed sophisticated methods for negotiating these differences peacefully. Others experienced ongoing friction that sometimes erupted into open conflict. The legal systems that emerged from these pressures were unlike anything that had existed before in European history. Instead of uniform codes imposed by central authorities, many regions developed flexible frameworks that could accommodate multiple approaches to common problems. A single city might recognize different marriage customs for different ethnic communities while maintaining common standards for commercial transactions and property rights. This legal pluralism required unprecedented levels of negotiation and compromise. Judges couldn't simply apply established precedents when different communities had different precedents for similar situations. They had to develop new approaches that balanced competing claims while maintaining enough consistency to enable peaceful coexistence. The survivors were essentially inventing modern multiculturalism through trial and error. The educational implications were equally profound. Schools that had once focused primarily on preserving local traditions now had to prepare students for a world where they might encounter dozens of different ways of doing familiar things. Children learned not just specific skills, but meta skills that would enable them to adapt to unfamiliar circumstances and work with people from different backgrounds. This educational transformation produced young adults who were more flexible, more curious, and more confident than any previous generation in European history. They approached problems with an experimental attitude that their grandparents would have found both admirable and terrifying. They formed friendships and business partnerships across traditional boundaries with casual ease. They innovated constantly, not because they were rebels, but because innovation had become a normal part of life. The church faced particular challenges in ministering to these increasingly diverse and mobile populations. Traditional parish structures that had assumed stable, homogeneous communities proved inadequate for serving people who moved frequently and brought different spiritual traditions with them. Some regions experimented with more flexible forms of religious organization that could adapt to changing demographic patterns. New forms of devotion emerged that transcended regional and cultural boundaries. Mystical movements that emphasize personal spiritual experience gained followers among people who shared that focus, regardless of their geographic or ethnic origins. Pilgrimage routes became opportunities not just for religious observance, but for cultural exchange that enriched both spiritual and practical knowledge. The artistic expressions that emerged from this cultural ferment were unlike anything Europe had produced before. Painters began incorporating techniques and motifs from multiple traditions. Musicians combined instruments and melodies from different regions into new forms of composition. Writers drew on diverse storytelling traditions to create works that spoke to increasingly cosmopolitan audiences. But perhaps the most significant change was psychological. People who had grown up in this environment of constant cultural exchange developed different relationships with tradition, identity, and change itself. They understood tradition as something that could be modified and improved, rather than something that had to be preserved unchanged. They saw identity as something that could incorporate multiple influences, rather than something that required rejecting foreign elements. Most importantly, they viewed change as normal and often beneficial, rather than dangerous and destabilizing. This transformation in consciousness represented something genuinely revolutionary in human history. Previous civilizations had certainly experienced cultural mixing, but usually as a result of conquest or catastrophe. The post-plague networks were different because they emerged from voluntary cooperation among communities that recognized mutual benefits from exchange. People chose to participate because they discovered they could improve their lives by learning from others. The survivors had created something unprecedented, a civilization based on conscious collaboration rather than inherited hierarchy. This didn't mean they had eliminated conflict or inequality. But they had developed new methods for managing differences and new criteria for evaluating social arrangements. Success was measured by results rather than by conformity to traditional patterns. Regional governments began adapting to these new realities by developing more flexible and responsive approaches to administration. Instead of trying to impose uniform policies across diverse populations, they began experimenting with federal arrangements that allowed local communities considerable autonomy while maintaining coordination on issues that affected multiple groups. Some of these experiments succeeded brilliantly, creating prosperous and stable regions that became models for others to emulate. Others failed catastrophically when competing interests couldn't find acceptable compromises. Most achieved mixed results that satisfied no one completely but proved workable enough to maintain over time. The economic systems that emerged from this process were more complex and more dynamic than anything medieval Europe had previously known. Markets operated according to principles that incorporated both traditional concerns about fairness and new understandings about efficiency. Banking and credit systems evolved to serve increasingly sophisticated commercial relationships. Even labor organization adapted to accommodate workers who might move frequently and needed to transfer their skills across different regional systems. The survivors weren't following any grand plan or ideological blueprint. They were simply trying to solve practical problems in ways that would enable as many people as possible to live decent lives. But their pragmatic innovations collectively produced something remarkable. A civilization that had learned to thrive on diversity rather than despite it. This transformation would prove to be one of the most significant developments in European history. The networks of exchange and cooperation that emerged from the plague years would provide the foundation for the Renaissance, the age of exploration, and eventually the scientific revolution. The intellectual habits that the survivors developed through necessity would become the standard approaches to knowledge and innovation in subsequent centuries. But even as communities celebrated their growing sophistication and prosperity, new challenges were emerging that would test their adaptive capabilities in unexpected ways. The very success of their collaborative approaches was creating opportunities and complications that no one had anticipated. The world they were building was more interconnected, more dynamic, and more full of possibilities than anything their ancestors could have imagined. It was also more demanding, more unpredictable, and more dependent on continued innovation for its success. The strange rebirth that had followed the Black Death was revealing itself as something far more complex and ongoing than simple recovery from catastrophe. The survivors had not just rebuilt their civilization, they had fundamentally reimagined what civilization could be, and the changes they had set in motion would continue transforming European society in ways that would echo through history for centuries to come. As the 15th century dawned, the true magnitude of this transformation was becoming apparent to thoughtful observers across the continent. They were living through something unprecedented in human experience, the conscious evolution of an entire civilization. The survivors had learned not just to adapt to change, but to direct change toward purposes they chose for themselves. They had discovered that the future wasn't something that happened to them, but something they could actively create through their choices and efforts. This realization would prove to be their most enduring legacy. Long after the specific innovations of the post-plague period had been superseded by further developments, the fundamental insight that human beings could consciously shape their own societies would continue influencing European thought and practice. The survivors had given their descendants something more valuable than any particular institution or technique. They had given them confidence in their own agency and creativity. The world that emerged from the Black Death wasn't just different from what had come before. It was consciously designed to be capable of continued difference, continued improvement, continued adaptation to whatever challenges and opportunities the future might bring. The survivors had created a civilization that understood change as its natural state rather than as a threat to its stability. And in doing so, They had laid the groundwork for all the remarkable transformations that would define European history in the centuries ahead. The children born in the 1420s grew up in a world their great-grandparents couldn't have comprehended. Not because it looked dramatically different, though it did in countless small ways, but because it felt different. These weren't children who expected to inherit their father's exact position in an unchanging hierarchy. They were children who assumed they would need to figure things out for themselves, and more remarkably, they were confident they could do it. Picture a 10-year-old girl in a German market town helping her mother negotiate grain prices with a merchant from 300 miles away. She's listening to terms being discussed in a mixture of languages, watching her mother calculate exchange rates in her head, observing how different regional customs affect the same basic transaction. This child is absorbing lessons about adaptability and negotiation that would have been incomprehensible to earlier generations who lived their entire lives within a 20-mile radius. But it wasn't just the practical skills that were different. It was the assumptions underlying those skills. This girl expected to have choices about her future that her grandmother never dreamed of. She anticipated that the world would continue changing throughout her lifetime, and she was preparing herself accordingly. Most remarkably, she believed that her own decisions and efforts could influence how those changes unfolded. This transformation in childhood experience was perhaps the most profound indicator of how completely European society had been reimagined. When you're raising children for a world that doesn't exist yet, but that you're confident they can help create, you're operating from fundamentally different premises than societies that assume the future will resemble the past. The educational innovations that emerged during this period reflected these changed expectations. Schools began teaching what we might now recognize as critical thinking skills, though they wouldn't have used that term. Children learned to compare different approaches to similar problems, to question claims that couldn't be verified, and to experiment with new methods when established ones proved inadequate. They studied local history not just as received tradition, but as a record of how previous generations had adapted to changing circumstances. More importantly, they learned to see themselves as active participants in ongoing historical processes rather than passive recipients of predetermined destinies. A boy studying the plague years didn't just memorize dates and mortality statistics. He analyzed how different communities had responded to crisis, what strategies had worked better than others, and what lessons might apply to future challenges. Education was becoming preparation for conscious participation in social evolution. The psychological implications of this shift were staggering. Previous generations had found meaning through conformity to established patterns and fulfillment of predetermined roles. These children were learning to find meaning through contribution to collective problem-solving and personal growth within supportive communities. They developed resilience not through stoic acceptance of suffering, but through confidence in their ability to work with others to improve difficult situations. This doesn't mean childhood became easier, or that young people faced fewer challenges. In many ways, life was more demanding because it required more conscious choice and active engagement, but it was also more hopeful because those, rather than as evidence of divine punishment or natural challenges, were understood as opportunities for development inevitability. The family structures that evolved to support this new approach to childhood were more flexible and more collaborative than their medieval predecessors. Parents who had experienced rapid social change during their own lifetimes understood that their children would need to be even more adaptable. They focused on teaching principles and methods rather than specific conclusions, on developing capabilities rather than transmitting fixed knowledge. Extended families became less important as sources of identity and security, but voluntary associations became more important. Children grew up participating in multiple overlapping communities: the craft guild their parents belonged to, the neighborhood school they attended, the religious congregation their family was part of, the trading network their region participated in. This exposure to diverse perspectives and approaches prepared them for lives that would likely involve even more variety and change. Marriage patterns reflected these evolving attitudes about individual development and social relationships. Young people expected to have significant influence over their own matrimonial choices, but they also understood those choices as opportunities to create partnerships that would contribute to community welfare as well as personal happiness. Romantic love became more important, but so did practical compatibility and shared values about how to navigate an uncertain future together. The economic systems that emerged during this period were designed to accommodate and reward this kind of individual agency within collective frameworks. Labour markets became more flexible as people developed skills that could be applied in multiple contexts rather than being tied to specific hereditary roles. Property ownership became more accessible as people could purchase land and buildings with earned income rather than only inheriting them through family connections. But perhaps most significantly, economic relationships became more contractual and less hierarchical. People entered into agreements because they saw mutual benefits rather than because traditional obligations compelled them to do so. This created more dynamic and responsive economic systems, but it also required higher levels of trust and communication than had been necessary under more rigid arrangements. The legal frameworks that evolved to govern these complex relationships were remarkable for their sophistication and flexibility. Instead of uniform codes applied mechanically regardless of circumstances, many regions developed adaptive systems that could accommodate different situations while maintaining consistent principles. Judges became mediators as much as decision makers, helping parties find mutually acceptable solutions rather than simply imposing predetermined punishments. This approach to law reflected broader changes in how people understood justice itself. Traditional medieval concepts had emphasized punishment of violations and maintenance of established hierarchies. The new systems focused more on restoration of relationships and prevention of future conflicts. Communities that had learned to survive through cooperation were more interested in healing social bonds than in asserting abstract principles. Women's roles continued evolving within these changing frameworks, though progress was neither uniform nor uncontested. The economic opportunities that had opened during the immediate post-plague period gradually became more institutionalized. Some regions formally recognized women's rights to own property, operate businesses, and participate in guild activities. Others maintained traditional restrictions while informally tolerating practices that violated those restrictions. But the psychological changes were perhaps more significant than the formal legal ones. Women who had grown up expecting to make meaningful contributions to their community's welfare developed different relationships with authority, tradition, and their own capabilities. They raised daughters who assumed they would need to be economically productive and socially engaged, creating generational changes that continued long after the specific circumstances that had triggered them had passed. The Church adapted to these evolving social realities with varying degrees of success across different regions. Some religious authorities embraced the changes, developing new forms of ministry that served more educated and independent congregations. They emphasized personal spiritual development and community service, rather than just institutional obedience. Others resisted change and found themselves increasingly irrelevant to populations that had learned to address their spiritual needs through alternative means. New forms of religious expression continued emerging from this ferment. Lay religious movements that emphasized direct spiritual experience and social action gained followers among people who wanted more active roles in their faith communities. Mystical traditions that had once been confined to monasteries began attracting ordinary people who sought deeper spiritual lives while remaining engaged with worldly responsibilities. The artistic and cultural productions of this period reflected the growing sophistication and confidence of post-plague European society. Literature began featuring protagonists who solved problems through intelligence and cooperation, rather than just enduring suffering or waiting for divine intervention. Music became more complex and varied as composers drew on diverse traditions while developing new forms of expression. Visual arts incorporated realistic observations of daily life alongside traditional religious and mythological themes. But perhaps most remarkably, these cultural innovations were being produced by much more diverse groups of people than had been involved in the earlier artistic movements. Literacy rates were high enough that many ordinary craftsmen, merchants, and farmers could participate in written culture. Urban communities supported multiple forms of entertainment and education that served different tastes and interests. Even small towns might have amateur theatrical groups, informal debating societies, or reading circles that discussed recent literary works. This democratization of cultural participation had profound implications for how European society understood itself and its possibilities. When large numbers of people are actively engaged in creating and consuming cultural works, those works necessarily reflect more diverse perspectives and experiences than when cultural production is confined to small elite groups. The stories people told about themselves became more complex, more realistic, and more hopeful. Regional variations in these patterns created fascinating laboratories for different approaches to social organization. Some areas developed highly centralized systems that coordinated activities across large territories. Others preferred decentralized arrangements that allowed maximum local autonomy. Most found hybrid approaches that balanced coordination with flexibility depending on the specific challenges they faced. These experiments in governance were closely watched by neighboring communities who were eager to learn from both successes and failures. An innovative approach to urban planning developed in one city might be adapted by dozens of others within a few years. A successful method for managing rural-urban trade relationships could spread across an entire region in a single generation. The survivors had created systems for learning from each other that accelerated social development beyond anything their ancestors could have imagined. International relationships began reflecting these new approaches to cooperation and competition. Instead of the rigid hierarchical alliances that had characterized earlier medieval diplomacy, regions began forming more flexible networks based on mutual interests and shared values. Trade relationships became more important than traditional feudal obligations in determining political alignments. This shift toward more pragmatic and responsive forms of international cooperation created opportunities for smaller communities to influence broader political developments. A prosperous trading city could become regionally influential through its economic connections, even if it lacked traditional claims to political authority. A region that developed innovative approaches to common problems might find its methods being studied and adopted far beyond its immediate neighbors. The technological innovations that emerged during this period were remarkable, not just for their ingenuity, but for how quickly they spread through the networks of communication and exchange that connected European communities. Agricultural improvements developed in one valley would reach farmers across the continent within a few growing seasons. Manufacturing techniques pioneered in one workshop would be adapted by craftsmen in distant cities before the year was out. This acceleration of technological development created positive feedback loops that drove continued innovation. Communities that successfully adopted new techniques became more prosperous, which gave them resources to invest in further improvements. Regions that developed reputations for innovation attracted talented individuals who contributed additional insights and capabilities. The survivors had created conditions that rewarded creativity and punished stagnation in ways that encouraged continued progress. The demographic recovery that had begun tentatively in the decades immediately following the plague had accelerated into robust population growth by the early 1400s. But this wasn't just numerical increase. The quality of life had improved dramatically for most people. Better nutrition, improved housing, more effective medical care, and greater economic security meant that people lived longer and healthier lives than their ancestors had enjoyed. This demographic vitality created its own momentum for continued development. Larger populations could support more specialized occupations, more sophisticated institutions, and more ambitious collective projects. They could also absorb economic disruptions more easily and recover more quickly from local disasters. The survivors had built demographic resilience that made their communities more capable of handling whatever challenges the future might bring. By the 1430s, thoughtful observers across Europe were beginning to recognize that they were witnessing something unprecedented in human history. Not just recovery from catastrophe, but conscious evolution toward new forms of social organization that were more responsive to human needs and more capable of continued adaptation. The survivors had learned to see change as opportunity rather than threat, cooperation as strength rather than weakness, and the future as something they could actively shape rather than passively endure. The psychological transformation that accompanied these social changes was perhaps even more significant than the institutional innovations themselves. People who had grown up expecting to participate actively in ongoing processes of community development approached problems differently, formed relationships differently, and raised children differently than their ancestors had. They had developed what we might now recognize as a growth mindset that assumed challenges could be overcome through effort and collaboration. So here we are, at the end of our journey through Europe's strangest chapter. What began as catastrophe became something unprecedented, the conscious reinvention of human society. The survivors didn't just rebuild what the plague had destroyed. They created something entirely new, a civilization that understood change as its natural state, rather than as a threat to be resisted. The Black Death had shattered every assumption about how the world worked, but from those broken pieces, ordinary people constructed something extraordinary. A society where peasants could become merchants, where knowledge belonged to everyone, where communities governed themselves, and where the future felt less like fate and more like choice. They'd discovered that the world wasn't fixed by divine decree, but malleable, responsive to human effort and imagination. That realization would echo through European history for centuries to come, providing the foundation for everything that followed. The Renaissance, the scientific revolution, the age of exploration, all of it grew from seeds planted by survivors who learned that questioning everything wasn't rebellion, it was survival. So the next time someone tells you that people can't change, that systems are permanent, that this is just how things have always been, remember the plague survivors. They faced the unthinkable and not only endured, they evolved. They proved that even in our darkest moments, even when half the world seems to be ending, human ingenuity and cooperation can create something beautiful from the ashes. Sometimes it takes losing everything to discover what we're truly capable of building together.